David Limbrick MLC.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again, Minister and team, for appearing again today. I'd like to direct my first question to Professor Sutton, and I imagine you already have an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, but I'll start with a bit of preamble. So on November 3rd, as part of my role as an MP, I go to witness some of the responses to the pandemic that the government has been doing, and on November 3rd, Cup Day, there was a protest planned just outside there, and I would estimate there was probably about between 1,000 and 1,500 people that turned up there. We've had a number of submissions to the inquiry that give an account of this protest, so I realise you wouldn't have read all the submissions, so rather than hear my description of it, I'd like to just quote a couple of paragraphs from this submission. This is submission 210A from a name withheld. And this person is describing the point at which the police surrounded people. I can personally attest to the accuracy of what this person is saying because I witnessed nearly everything that they are talking about personally. And I'll quote, I also noticed that the hundreds of police officers began to slowly encircle us to a point where we were kettled in, kettling is the name of the tactic used, so tightly and then detained for up to 3 to 4 hours for no reason. While we were detained, women were having anxiety attacks and difficulty in breathing. Some needed to go to the toilet, as I could hear that they had women issues. I might add that women were yelling out that they were having their period and needed to go to the toilet. I personally heard this, but the police officers wouldn't release us. It was a warm day and people within the circle requested water, and eventually after an hour or more we were given some water from a bucket, which I later discovered was borrowed from the pub. During that time, an elderly man within the circle approached the police officers encircling us and asked to go to the toilet. Immediately, they headlocked him and hauled him off in such a terrible manner it was horrifying to see. The elderly man needed to go to the toilet. He had been detained for more than 3 hours. I eventually saw him later sitting on a chair with his shirt unbuttoned with 2 police officers attending to him as he had 2 stickers on his chest with wire coming out of them. The brutal attack obviously affected him. Why would they drag and wrestle an elderly man for requesting to use the toilet? End quote. Well, the answer to that is that the police were enforcing and giving out fines for breaching Section 203 of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, and the reason given, which seems quite crazy to me, was that they were congregating in groups of 10 people or more than 10 people. So my question to you, Professor Sutton, is wouldn't this type of enforcement of these public health directions increase the risk of disease transmission rather than reduce it?
I wasn't there. I accept your account as a direct witness and as someone who knows other individuals who were present. My advice in framing public health directions are around reducing the risk of transmission. That's why the public health directions have limited public gatherings to various sizes at different points in the epidemic. In terms of what the tactical or strategic response of police are in managing that, I think it's for them to answer how best they do it. But it always remains the public health advice that the greater distance that you can have between people, the lesser the risk of transmission of a virus should someone be infected, and of course the reduced amount of time that people are in close contact and the reduction in the number of people, especially those who don't know each other, who don't normally reside together, are all measures that reduce the risk of transmission. But how police tactically manage the dilemma, I guess, of people gathering against the public health directions in terms of the limitations framed in those directions on gathering sizes is a matter for Victoria Police.
And thank you, Professor Sutton. Did you have any consultation with police before this event and like how they might go about managing these restrictions?
No, I did not. I wasn't aware that the event was taking place.
Okay. And one thing that we've spoken about before, and I brought this up with the Premier last week as well, we have 2 things here. One is the public health directions, and the other is the enforcement of those directions. And we've discussed this before, that when your team is coming up with the public health directions. They have to be proportionate and the least restrictive of rights. What I don't understand, and what I think many people don't understand, is how can you be sure that the public health directions that are being issued are the least restrictive of rights when the restrictions of those rights are actually handled by Victoria Police, which is totally separate, apparently, to the creation of those directions? How can you be certain that they are actually the least restrictive of rights when you don't have any input into the enforcement?
And the framing of least restrictive is in terms of the threshold numbers, if you like, for the kind of directions that have been put in place. So on the size of gatherings, on the time that people are permitted to be engaged in a particular activity. So those public health directions are informed by that balancing of risk of transmission against the constraints on people's movement and people's assembly. One never knows in absolute terms if you could have had lesser constraints because we don't have an alternative universe in which transmission has played out differently. But we are always mindful of the fact that we are trying to constrain to the smallest extent possible people's individual rights and liberties, but still manage really what I would regard as the most profound threat to liberty, which is an uncontrolled epidemic where tens of thousands of people can contract illness and hundreds of people can die, including on a daily basis, if you don't get control of that transmission.
Thank you, Professor Sutton.
Sorry, Mr Limbrick, could I just interrupt you for a moment? The submission that you've been referring to was published on the basis that the name was withheld. Could you just be careful not to say anything that might subsequently identify the name?
Yes, yes. I don't know this person at all. It just happens to coincide with my experience, but I don't know who this actually is. So it is, and it was published on the website. So we have a situation, though, where the creation of these directions has, when you were formulating, or when your team was formulating that direction, you imagined what rights might be limited by that, but clearly the enforcement of that has resulted in other rights being taken away from Victorians. As a direct result of the creation of that direction, it would appear that you didn't imagine that people's liberty would, by the gathering of more than 10 people restriction, that they wouldn't be deprived of their liberty for being in the city for a number of hours and pushed together like that, and some of the other awful things that I described in this submission and I also witnessed. You know, what's the response here? I mean, certainly there are more rights being restricted than are envisaged when the public health directions are being created. It's clear by the evidence, isn't it?
I would say that it's true of any law that has a potential police response. Any law could have the potential for police requiring enforcement that, as you rightly point out, infringes people in other ways in order to enforce that law. It's a matter for Victoria Police to manage that in a way that they see as the most appropriate and proportionate and should be cognizant of the rights of individuals under law.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton, Professor Sutton. With the evidence for these directions and the Human Rights Charter assessments, I believe that they're done for all of these, but they haven't been published. I spoke to the Premier about this last week. There's been a summary of advice in the Statement of Emergency Extensions, which I provided my feedback on that, and it wasn't particularly flattering. But these assessments, so they're not public, so the public doesn't get to see these charter assessments. Are they sent to the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission? Have they seen the evidence and the charter assessments? Is that something that they review?
Not that I'm aware of, but those assessments are made in each and every direction and each iteration of every direction that's made.
Yes.
And they must be considered by me and the legal team provide that with any highlights of things that are of concern or need to be emphasised in terms of, the difficult balancing of rights and liberties.
So and thank you, Professor Sutton. So if it turns out that the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission doesn't have access to that, the evidence or the charter assessments, it would not be possible for them to determine if to independently determine if these restrictions were proportionate and the least restrictive of rights without seeing those assessments. Would that be correct?
It's a given to me, if they can't see them, that they can't make a determination in relation to them.
Who can make that determination independently of your team?
Well, I know that any individual can challenge the public health direction.
We've seen a court challenge,
yeah,
yes.
and that can come before the court in terms of a question of proportionality or legitimacy.
But how could I, as a Member of Parliament, and it's my job to scrutinise this, I want to independently verify that, that I'm satisfied that this is proportionate and the least restrictive of rights. It's impossible for me to do that. In fact, the only way that I can do that is to get out on the street and witness the results of the directions and make my own assessment. And, I don't buy it, basically. What's your response to that? How can anyone know that this is the least restrictive outside of your team?
I'm not a legal expert. I would leave it to
well, it's not even a legal issue, really. I mean, you could frame it as a legal issue, but I'm not trying to frame it as a legal issue. I'm trying to say, well, are there other options that your team could have come up with that would have been less restrictive of rights? And, I think, I look at the results on the ground and it seems like there might be.
I think it's a legal issue in terms of what the avenues are for individuals to examine laws made under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and the emergency declarations under that.
Okay, thank you. And another thing with the public health directions, and we've spoken about this before, in the legislation you've got a couple of options. You can either base it on the best scientific evidence, or you can base these directions on the precautionary principle if you don't have full evidence. I think we've spoken about this before. I know you won't know exactly off the top of your head, but as a guide, what proportion of these directions are relying on the precautionary principle rather than direct evidence?
Oh, they're not mutually exclusive considerations. You can have evidence and you still apply the precautionary principle because the alternative has played out globally. We've seen jurisdictions, countries take action at the height of transmission where an earlier intervention that can look excessive, is often accused of being excessive, is missed. That opportunity is missed because the actions are taken when the health system is under stress, when the numbers of people presenting for acute care or who are dying is actually peaking. So I wouldn't say that you either have evidence or the precautionary principle, but the precautionary principle, as you rightly point out, says that in the absence of absolute clarity, that it should be a consideration. And I would say that in probably the majority of considerations that the precautionary principle is at play, because the alternative, as I say, is that it can get away from you, whereby the cure, if you like, the response, is even harder, even longer, even more constraining of personal freedoms and rights than if you take an earlier and sometimes apparently more robust or more excessive response.
Thank you, Professor Sutton. And yeah, on the issue of a more excessive response, we've seen other countries take different responses to us, and I would say, maybe they would have been more successful here. We would have had controlled it quicker here if we had more restrictive things. Like in China, we saw those images of people's apartment doors being welded shut and all this sort of thing, like very, very shocking things to a free society like Australia. But it sort of begs the question that if there's a more extreme response and there's a lesser lesser response, like how do we know, how do Victorians know that the response that we've got isn't excessive?
It's my obligation under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act to consider those principles as outlined in the Act. And so that's my statutory duty. I have to make a consideration of not being excessive, to consider in absolute terms the question of proportionality. And so, I give my assurance that I have not taken actions that are more than is required to the best of my knowledge.
And thank you, Professor Sutton. And one of the things that's concerning me on top of this is because people don't see this evidence and these charter assessments, very soon we're going to be in a situation where public health teams are going to have to be communicating to everyone the idea that they'll take, like if a vaccine becomes recognised as safe and effective, public health teams are going to have to communicate that to the public and say, this is a safe and effective thing. I've had Minister Foley said that it won't be a mandatory thing, so it'll be a matter of people trusting public health experts. What sort of actions do you think are going to be necessary to get that trust of people to believe that these medicines would be beneficial and not dangerous, and that they're safe and effective?
Look, it's a really critical question, and I think it'll be the most important task ahead of us in lots of ways, to build the trust and rapport in the vaccine that will be, I'm sure, going through the regulatory processes in Australia and getting to a point where it's approved. I think it involves all levels of government. I think we need to work with our academic partners and other experts in the field to be really clear about our understanding, any uncertainties that might remain, to hear the concerns, to respond to them rationally and scientifically, and to be as engaged as we possibly can be with those who are supportive, those who are ambivalent, and those who are vociferously against the idea of vaccination. I think that engagement is absolutely critical, and we shouldn't shy away from it. I think the task begins now, and I have no doubt that we will work with all of our jurisdictional counterparts and the Commonwealth Government around people building trust in the vaccine and all the information that's coming from independent public health experts around the country.
Thank you very much, Professor Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Limbrick.